Now, I'm thrilled to say that Paul Kelly joins me now. Welcome to the program, Paul. Thank you so much for your time and for your important work on this topic of the rising anti-Semitism.
Very good to be with you, Sharri.
Now, let's start with this moral confusion that the left finds itself in. What do you think is happening?
Well, look, I think that it's perfectly legitimate for the pro-Palestinian cause and for the left to protest and campaign against Israel's war, to campaign against the Israeli government. But this is a war between Israel and a terrorist organisation, Hamas, that stands for the liquidation of Israel and for the liquidation of the Jewish people in the Middle East. So clearly there is a fundamental moral question here. And I think if people are going to campaign on behalf of the Palestinian cause, then it's incumbent upon them to spell out precisely where they stand, and in particular spell out whether they disagree and dissent from the agenda of Hamas. Now, what's happened so far is to a large extent, both in Australia and much of the rest of the world, in terms of the street demonstrations and in terms of many prominent people supporting the Palestinian cause, they have not been prepared to make that distinction. There's a moral fudge there, and I think that's a fundamental issue. It's a fundamental political and it's a fundamental moral issue.
Now, you write in your piece how there's this rift on how Peter Dutton thinks that anti-Semitism should be handled and what's happening within the Albanese government. You cite that some politicians, including Tony Burke, but also you say the normally sensible Murray Watt, have been unable to condemn the protests at the Sydney Theatre Company. Can you talk to me about why the Albanese government finds it so difficult to unequivocally say anti-Semitism is not good enough and to actually put it on the national agenda and deal with it?
Well, I think this is a real problem, and I think it's going to be important in revealing the character of the Albanese government, and I think the government should reflect upon this. So the way I interpret the government's position at the moment, the government wants to play down this issue in the community, and it thinks that the best approach as far as the government is concerned is not to talk about it. Now, clearly, when there's an outrageous event, as we saw at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Melbourne a few weeks ago, then the Prime Minister quite properly speaks out against that. But I think the overall approach of the government is to try to play down the issue, keep people calm as much as possible. Then, to the extent that they want to talk about anti-Semitism, they want to be even-handed, and they link this all the time with Islamophobia, implying, of course, that there's an even-handed relationship and an even-handed connection there. Now, I think that is a distortion of the issue. I don't think that is an accurate presentation of the real issue. We know what's going on globally. We're seeing a very significant increase globally in anti-Semitism. I mean, this is a civilisational issue, and we're seeing it also in this country, although not as badly as we're seeing in some other Western nations. So I think the government has got to be very careful about the way it handles this. In relation to the Sydney Theatre Company, it's sad and pathetic to see senior ministers in the Albanese government not even able to take the stand the Sydney Theatre Company took against the antics of these actors, and pretending, we have these ministers pretending that this is about artistic freedom. Well, that's nonsense. Most people know it's nonsense. And the fact that they can't even take a stand on this issue, which in some ways wasn't all that important, it would have been fairly easy to have taken a stand on that issue, they couldn't do it. Well, what's this tell you about the government?
Absolutely. I mean, I can say what I think it tells you about the government, which is that it doesn't seem to care about Jewish Australians. But I hope that's not the case. But there's no courage here. You also examine in two of your recent articles the role of universities in, being the hotbeds of this anti-Semitism, this, anti-Israel sentiment, but it does go so far, and now Jews are not feeling safe on campuses. You spoke to Julian, Lisa about this as well. What can be done in this situation? Do we need to see more leadership from university chiefs,
chancellors? Absolutely, we need to see more leadership. It's extraordinary. I mean, I spoke to Allegra Spender and Julian Lisa last week. They were both very firm on this issue. there is a fundamental problem in the university sector in this country. Julie and Lisa referred to various surveys that have been done. It's clear that to a significant extent, Jewish students feel unsafe on campus. Not only do they feel unsafe on campus, but they feel the university leadership and the university administration will not provide proper support for them. So I don't think there's any doubt there's an issue. We've seen, of course, what's happened over recent days in the United States in relation to Penn, Harvard and MIT, where the leaders failed completely in the evidence they gave. And we've seen at Penn, the president and the chair of the board have had to resign. This is extraordinary. So anyone who thinks there's no moral crisis, well, that doesn't stand up at all. There's clearly a fundamental crisis, a fundamental moral crisis going on in some of our elite American institutions. And I think all the evidence and the surveys point to the fact there is a problem in the Australian university sector.
Look, the piece you wrote on anti-Semitism before this most recent one, you spoke to prominent Jewish Australians and other figures, and you detailed about how this anti-Semitism we're seeing in Australia truly is unprecedented for Australia. It's gotten so bad, and yet, as you just said a moment ago, Anthony Albanese and his ministers want to pretend it's not happening. They don't want to make a noise about this issue. I mean, you can't just look the other way and pretend a crisis isn't happening, that a crisis in social cohesion isn't happening.
I think there is a problem for the government here because there's clearly a very significant increase in anti-Semitism in this country of a dimension that has shocked many people, and we've had many prominent leaders of the Jewish community spell this out. We had in recent weeks that petition signed by hundreds of Australians, hundreds of prominent Australians, which made it very clear as far as they're concerned, this is an important issue, this is a fundamental issue, yet we see a lack of response from the government. Now, I don't want to be unfair to the government, but I think it is accurate and fair to say that there has been an inadequate response from the government. They have not responded to the issue as such, and the issue as such is the rising tenor of anti-Semitism in this country. And I think the government's got to be very, very conscious of the inadequacy of its present approach, which is to play down the issue and whenever it talks about it, just link it with discrimination against Islam and the Muslim community.
And it's not that there is never any Islamophobia, of course not. And it's not that it's not an important issue, of course it is. But, you know, you can't equate the two. We aren't seeing people driving through suburbs where there's a high Muslim population intimidating them and terrifying them, which is what's happening to the Jewish community. You know, we've seen protests outside of synagogues. I revealed last week a group of 4 13-year-olds at the local shopping centre. You know, there was an incident with a swastika box thrown at them. It's every single day. Paul, just before you'd go, I'd love to get your reflections more broadly on the Albanese government. We're about midway or potentially more, 2/3, depending on when the election is called, through its term. It had a long honeymoon, a very extended honeymoon, but it ends the year in a disastrous position. Where do you think this is heading next year?
I don't think it's in a disastrous position, Sharri, but I think it's in a pretty difficult position where a lot of support for the government has certainly evaporated, and the government's got really serious structural problems. What the government has got to do is it's got to shift the focus very much to the economy. But the problem it's got with the economy is that these are structural issues. Whether we're talking now about inflation, interest rates, cost of living, per capita income, there's going to be no easy solution to those issues. So while it's got to focus on the economy, it's going to be hard to actually deliver immediate benefits or benefits before the next election when it comes to the economy. But I think analysing the situation, we've got to draw a distinction between the Albanese government getting into difficulty, and it certainly has, and thinking that this naturally translates into support for the Peter Dutton-led coalition. I don't think that's the case. And I think this is the problem with quite a lot of the analysis at the moment. I think what we're going to see at the next election is a significant increase in the vote for third parties and independents. That is, I think Albanese will lose support. Some of that support will go to Peter Dutton, but a significant amount of that support will go to third parties and independents. So at this stage, I'd say the threat to Albanese...
in Liberal seats or in some Labor seats as well, the Teals?
So at this stage, it seems to me, the real threat is not so much that Albanese will lose the Prime Ministership at the next election, but he may well be forced into minority government. That would be a really significant setback for him. After one term to be thrown into minority government. That, I think, would be a very good result for the coalition and a pretty grim outcome for the Labor Party.